Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is trade networks. Now, this lecture is meant to be a bridge of sorts. But before we cross that bridge, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, as I said, this lecture is about trade networks, and this is meant to be a bridge lecture. It is both a conclusion to the classical era empire age that we've been talking about, and simultaneously is a link or bridge into the post-classical period. The main important thing is that it is really during the classical age that these trade networks form. And then they continue to grow and evolve and develop during and after the next era of history, next period. Now, if you were in class right now, one of the things I would do right now is I would be playing a little video for you. And of course, it is the intro to Disney's Aladdin. If you watch the original anime from the 1990s, it's Robin Williams as the genie, as the peddler in the market, who's going to go and explain how this entire thing goes on. I won't play it all here for you.
It's a faraway place where the caravan camels roam, where you wander among every culture and tongue. It's chaotic, but hey, it's home. When the wind's from the east and the sun's from the west and the sand in the glass is right, come on down, stop on by, up a carpet and fly to another Arabian night.
And I'm going to stop it right there, only for time's sake. And if you want to watch the intro to the movie, by all means do so. Of course, that was a live action with Will Smith playing the genie this time. But the idea that song is trying to convey, besides setting up the premise of the movie, is that, as he mentions in the song, these fabled bazaars. And what they show in both the animated and live action are these bazaars where there are different goods you can buy and sell and trade at these markets. And that is at the heart of what we're trying to do today. So, this lecture is all about building up into the post-classical period this inter-regional, trans-regional trade networks. Most were indirect, but they were highly organized. They were a creation of networks that was communication, it was exchange across the Afro-Eurasian world, with a separate web in parts of the Americas. And again, it's important to think of it this way. This is not the old triangle trade idea that you learned in middle school. No. Think of these networks as a web of exchange, like a spider web radiating out. And it goes in every different direction. Goods come and go. They cross over land, they cross over seas, or sometimes both. These are trade networks that link Greenland to Western Europe, Western and Eastern Europe to the Muslim world, Muslim world to Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia to India, and Southeast Asia to East Asia. It's the role of Central Asia in the trans-Eurasian trade. And of course, it also links with maritime trade. Now, at a very basic level, why does this happen? Well, it happens trade happens because people want goods. Salt, for instance, becomes highly sought after in this era because not only does it help food taste better, and if you watch any good cooking show on Food Network, you gotta have salt, it also is used to preserve food in the era before refrigeration. Merchants, you find, they're willing to take great risks in hopes of bringing in great profits. And of course, one of the things that you'll see is not just that goods are exchanged, but rather it's ideas, it's people, it's culture, it's religion, it's technology. It is the spread of civilization, civilized societal ideas to the periphery from already established cultures and nations. It altered consumption patterns. It encouraged specialization. It diminished economic self-sufficiency of local localities. Traders themselves formed their own unique guild or social group. And at times it provided a means of social mobility. Simultaneously, it also provided luxury goods for the elites. So, this network of long-distance commerce is a notable feature for what we would refer to as the third wave civilizations. Now, we have the first, original six, then we have the Age of Empires and the Classical period. Now we're going to move into the post-classical, which becomes the third wave civilizations. And again, I want to reiterate this. This is an important point. While most of what I'm going to talk about today is post-600 CE, i.e. the post-classical period, all these networks have their beginnings during that Age of Empire. When we talk about things like the Roman Road or the Persian Royal Road, these are things that facilitate not just travel, but also trade networks. Now, early on, these trade networks are going to grow and increase connection between peoples. These connections occur because of the trade. But early on, it was often controlled by the nomads, or these nomadic groups on the peripheries of nations, on the peripheries of civilizations. It involved the transfer of technologies, of religions, and of course, technology and religion would piggyback on the goods, so to speak, that were being taken across the trade routes. Now, ultimately, geography makes a big difference here. Geography determines what, where, and by whom it was exchanged. Climate and topography, including mountains, plains, deserts, rivers, seas, will determine what valuable minerals are found, or what type of plants are offered, where seaports are at, or mountain passes, or oases exist, that raw materials can be produced and then transported. We also see in this period the new innovations when it comes to trade, including the use of coinage. We talked about it in the past with both the Persians and the Romans who began printing specific coins. They had the image of their emperor's face on it. But starting in the 9th century CE, we have the first issue of paper money. In China, it was referred to as flying money because it was made of silk. And in the 9th century, the Chinese used it because carrying paper money, again, all this is like a certificate made of silk paper. It was, again, the term is flying money. It was used because it was so much easier to carry, weight-wise, than coins, it was just quite heavy because it's metal. And the idea was at various points throughout the Chinese empires, these paper could be exchanged for coins at any point. Or as the government backed the value of them in a very similar way to even today. In the United States, we have the dollar, or other nations have the currencies of paper money. And by the 14th century, when the Mongols take over, we'll talk about the Mongols later, the Mongols are going to bring that paper money into Central and Southwest Asia as it begins to expand beyond the original Chinese borders. So what we're going to do now is talk about these different trades. And it's going to be broken down largely into two main categories. Number one, land-based trade. And number two, maritime trade. And of course, the most famous of which is land-based trade, which you see on the screen. And these initial networks, the Silk Road trade. And I have the screen on the left here, or a list on the left of the screen right now. And take a moment, hit pause on this video, and jot down all these things. These are important because what they're showing you is a very interconnected world, if slow connection at times. It takes a long time to travel across the continent. But silk, teas, porcelain from China, woolen goods, horses, rice, camels, dates, almonds, and ivory from Central Asia, rubies, silvers, pepper, and ebony from India, carpets, linens, brocades, brooches, ceramics, iron from the Muslim world, wine, perfume, glass, slaves, olive oil from the Byzantine Empire, furs, wood, amber, slaves, and grain from Russia. And then later, gunpowder from China. And then we also see later on the tea and horse caravans that will extend into South Asia, from China. And then what's not pictured on the map on the very, very top up there is they will also extend east into Japan. The Silk Road trade becomes the largest land-based trade network. It is continuously being crossed by an increasingly number of nomadic peoples. This extended the reach of Xi'an, China, to the Mediterranean BC as early as the late 2nd century BCE. Horses were bred for food. The Chinese would pay the nomads tribute in silk. They would trade for horses. Nomads would then take that silk and the horses and trade for glass and iron in the West. Other products include peaches, apricots, cinnamon, ginger, spices. As traders going east would take alfalfa, grapes, pistachios, sesames, and spinach. Now, it's important to note one thing here. This is something we'll talk about in a later lecture regarding China specifically, but China was economically self-sufficient. And the emperors of China would send out these gifts to other nations basically to dictate and show, see how powerful we are. At least that was the premise, the idea of tribute and reverse tribute. But we'll get to it in a future lecture. What this trade does, though, is going to increase contacts with the outside world for every civilization. In the technical terminus or terminals of the Silk Road trade reach to Antioch in Syria on the west and Chang'an, China, the capital of China, in the east. Though, again, they'll spread further west as extension and spread south into South Asia and spread east into Japan. And again, it should come as no surprise. It's called the Silk Road trade because one of the most sought after, highly valued products of this trade was in fact Chinese silk. And during this era, it was only the Chinese who knew how to produce and make silk, as the silkworm had not been smuggled out of China yet. But as I said, it wasn't just products that you see on your screen here. It was also religion. Buddhism was spread into China, Korea, and Japan. Christianity will spread to Russia, China, and India. Islam will spread to Central, Western Asia, and into China. Technology will diffuse, including things like the Quanat system. The Quanat system was a form of irrigation that transported water from below the ground to the surface in order to irrigate arid areas and arid regions. Knowledge and use of the Quanat system will spread into other regions, particularly Southwest Asia, that will allow previously arid, dry areas to begin to produce agriculture, which will in turn grow new civilizations and larger global populations. Now, besides the obvious of food, material items, technology, and religion, there of course was one more big thing that traveled along it, and that was disease. Because as travelers went from one region to another, they brought diseases with them to regions that had, well, no previous experience or contact with the disease viruses. What you would normally refer to, and we talk about later with the Columbian Exchange when East and West hemispheres merge, is what we call virgin soil epidemics. The idea that a virus or disease reaches a new area in which people have no antibodies built up from years of exposure. And that's seemingly what happens with the Silk Road trade, the other land-based trades, trans-Saharan trade, and the maritime trades. And eventually it will happen after 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue and East meets West. But here, a few examples on the screen here. Back as early as the 400s BCE, there was an epidemic in Athens that was believed to be the result of trade routes. Both the Roman and the Han Empire were devastated by both smallpox and measles, in part due to trade networks. Bubonic plague from India ravaged the Mediterranean world in over a 200-year span between the 534 and 750 CE. And of course, famously, or maybe most famously, or infamously, the Black Death, that we believe spread through the Mongol trade networks into Europe between 1400 and 1500 CE. These are devastating effects that will have an impact on millions of people who will die as a result of these epidemics and pandemics. Likewise, though, the Silk Road trade is not alone. In the top of Africa, we get the Trans-Saharan trade. And of course, this is being facilitated largely by the use of camels, as it used to be thought that the Sahara Desert at the top of the northern part of Africa was a barrier that you couldn't cross. And man, to be clear, could not cross it on foot. But the use of the camel made desert travel possible. A camel could be burdened down with heavy loads of trade goods. And a camel can store enough water to go without water for 10 days. The result of this is traders began crisscrossing the Saharan Desert and would crisscross east to west across Africa. And so from the south, you get Lola nuts and palm oil. From West Africa, you get gold, ivory, slaves, exotic feathers, and spices. And again, quick note here about slaves. Note that this is not the race-based slave that we'll get to in the post-1500 world. This is, tribal slavery that usually is taken as a result of people who are taken captive. But from West Africa, these slaves would also be forced to carry goods and then sold not only the goods they were carrying, but sold themselves into slavery. From Muslim North Africa, we get salt and cloth and glass and metalwork and books. And again, that's key there. Knowledge is being expressed and transmitted. Also, merchants, missionaries, and travelers. And again, one more quick note on slaves. Most of these slaves were taken from other African tribes. They were taken as warring tribes, neighboring tribes, went to war with other tribes, and took captives. And they would be coming from further south in Africa, and then brought north and then forced to traverse the Saharan Desert. It is estimated that between 1100 and 1400, again, this is before the Atlantic slave trade, so between 1100 CE and 1400 CE, some 5,500 slaves were forced to cross the Saharan Desert each year. But what this entire thing means, again, whether it's slaves or goods or ideas or literature, is that we start seeing a huge rise with commerce that connects both West Africa, East Africa, and North Africa. You get commodities like dates. You get commodities like cotton, dyes, cloths, leather goods. And what ends up happening is, you can see on the top right of the screen there, is this will extend into what is now Southwest Asia, or what we now call the Middle East, where it'll pick up with the Silk Road trade, and then these goods from Africa will then be connected to either the Mediterranean maritime trade, the Red Sea Indian Ocean trade, or into the land-based Silk Road trade. And what we see then, what is this big significance here, is not only the facilitating the diffusion of goods, ideas, and people, but also we see the growth of kingdoms. One of the things that this trans-Saharan trade does is going to help create large kingdoms and civilizations in Africa, both on the east and west coast. And you see on the left of the screen right now some of these kingdoms that it helps create. And you see the map on the right. That we start having these large entities, these kingdoms on the coastline that become these trading posts that will connect the trans-Saharan trade to the larger trade networks of either the Indian Ocean trade, the Mediterranean Ocean, or Mediterranean Sea trade, or of course the aforementioned Silk Road trade. But it isn't just these two trade networks. We also have maritime trade networks. We have maritime trade networks, including the very famous Indian Ocean trade in the blue on the map on the right. We also have the Mediterranean Sea trade that you see on the top left map. And then you also, in the top left map, you see what will become the early transatlantic trade that we'll get to by the end of today. So the importance here, again, the same importance applies in the maritime trade as it does in the land-based trade, which is this is an exchange of goods, it's an exchange of people, it's an exchange of ideas, it's an exchange of technology. And it's going to open the interiors of trade networks to the coast and then be able to transport things quicker. We will see the rise of port cities, and that these port cities become the key to future great civilizations, kingdoms, and power. And it will again spread religion and spread disease. Now, again, this is important to know. We're treating them as separate, we're defining them as separate than the land-based trades. Remember, these are acting concurrently. They are overlapping with the land-based trades. They coexist. They're often safer than land-based trades because there are fewer stops and you can cover longer distances in short time. However, understand that storms, shipwrecks, and of course piracy will be a big hindrance to these maritime trades. In addition, you also have to secure government and state agreements because these merchants have to be allowed into these port cities, and sometimes are only allowed in certain areas of port cities, especially in places like China, who was very restrictive of who could enter the country or the nation. And again, they were not very welcoming of foreigners. Now, the primary geographic areas we're going to talk about, number one, of course, the Indian Ocean trade. Then we have the Mediterranean Sea trade along with the Black Sea trade. We have the North Sea trade that covers the Baltic Sea and the English Channel. And then, of course, we'll get to kind of hint at some of the Atlantic Ocean that begins to be crossed even before we talk about Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. Let's start with the most famous of which is the Indian Ocean trade. People had already been trading along the Red Sea, Arabian Peninsula, but what we see here in this era is people begin to expand further. So on the left of the screen, if I get my cursor here, you can see this area here of Mogadishu to what is modern day India here. This trade had been going on for, centuries already. What we see in this era, when we change the calendar from BCE to CE, is that this trade now begins to be extended beyond India into what is now the Polynesian Islands, the Philippines, and eventually reaching China. And these ships are going to allow a greater number of goods, including even the size of elephant, that will be able to be carried on these ships. And we'll see the Indian Ocean trade broken up into three distinct legs. The first leg is from Southeast China to Southeast Asia. And so you see that here within the South China Sea. That's leg number one. Leg number two is from Southeast Asia to India, this area over here, the Bay of Bengal. And then, of course, number three is what we call the Arabian Sea part that extends into the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea over here. That extends from India to Africa and into what is now the Middle East. Now, what is unique about this is each of these three zones, the South China zone, the Bay of Bengal zone, and the Arabian Sea zone, is each controlled by one dominant ethnic group. In the Western Arabian Sea area, Arabs control the trade. Indians control the Bay of Bengal phase or zone, and the Chinese control the eastern side of the South China Sea. This is the largest peaceful zone of exchange during this period. The groups had no written formal contract, but cooperated with one another. States worked to keep piracy down to a minimum. And the groups would meet at these large cities, these port cities, to trade and exchange items and people and ideas and religion and disease. And it links both to the Mediterranean and the Silk Road trade by land routes. In other words, Once these goods reached into the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, they would then be transmitted into the Mediterranean Sea up here on the top left, or connect here in the Persian Gulf to the one end of the Silk Road trade, or the other end in China to the Silk Road trade. So it creates a complete circle, a complete continuous loop. And again, they're trading for things that include things like silk, cotton, rice, spices, horses, ivory, gold, porcelain, and of course, people. It also is going to be a major conveyor of Buddhism from Southeast Asia into East and Southeast Asia. And also later on, Islam will be facilitated and expanded through the trade network of the Indian Ocean trade. Now, one thing that is unique here is the specialized knowledge it took. Because these traders, these ships, relied upon the winds and the ocean currents. And each of the groups, the Indians, the Muslims, and the Chinese, became expert readers of the calendar and of the winds and of the cycles of the oceans. They knew when monsoon season was. They knew when the storm season was. They knew when the monsoon winds would blow to make their trip, more efficient. They understood the natural clock of the ocean, and they were able to time their ships with these natural cycles of the sea to facilitate quicker, faster, more efficient trade. They also would exchange not just, say, technology like weapon technology, but also shipbuilding technologies, as different types of ships were used in order to sail the different seas. And of course, in the end, this connects people from all parts of Afro-Eurasia as one large, triple continent connecting to one another. And there's your three legs. You can see the types of ships that are being used, from the Dhow ships to the Arab ships, or the Latin type triangle ships, because they were used to maneuver in smaller areas. But again, people of all areas are going to participate in this trade. Then we move into the Mediterranean Sea and Black Sea trade. Now, this trade originally started with the Phoenicians and the Egyptians. We talked about Phoenicians earlier. But it's going to continue and expand under the Greek, the Roman, and the Byzantine empires. And it's going to link Europe to the much larger empire, or much larger trading network of both the Indian Ocean trade and the Silk Road trade. The major cities here are Constantinople, Alexandria in Africa, and Venice in the Mediterranean Sea. Venice is going to become a central hub for things like fine glass, woolen, wine, cloth from Europe. It will also transport silk, spices, and Asian goods to Europe from the Muslim regions. Egypt, Alexandria, will become a commercial center between three continents linking Europe, Africa, Middle East, and the Indian Ocean regions. These long-distance trades were handled by numerous middlemen, including Jews, Muslims, Armenians, Nestorians. And they'll be trading things like olives, pottery, glass, woodwork, leather, and wool textiles. Christianity will transmit across this region. And then you see the Black Sea trade, the Black Sea being right here where my cursor's at, right in the middle of the screen. The Constantinople will become a key port there, connecting the Silk Road to the Mediterranean Sea and also Russia, which also is responsible for the Black Death in the next era. A third maritime trade network. And again, here's a comparison here between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea was relatively calm, which also makes sailing slower. So they had to design sails to catch the winds, large square sails. However, in the Indian Ocean trade, these triangular lateen sails were used to catch the monsoon-style winds. There was no need for oars in the Indian Ocean because of the strong winds in the ocean, compared to the Mediterranean Sea, where you need people and men to actually row oars. A third network is in the transatlantic trade, as it's called. Again, when I say transatlantic, do not confuse this with the transatlantic trade that begins after colonization of the Americas by the Europeans post 1500. No. We're talking mostly about the English Channel in the Norwegian Sea north of Europe. But as we're going to see, and the legends hold true, that some groups, like the Vikings, were trading across the Atlantic Ocean even during this classical and post-classical period. Most of this trade, however, is confined to the Scandinavian countries and modern-day Great Britain area. And it's in these areas that are going to produce wood, copper, fish, and grain from Sweden, wax, honey, skins, slaves, amber from Russia. And this is going to help establish a state in Russia. And it will also spread Christianity into these northern regions. Now, the Vikings. Always fun to talk about the Vikings. This trade in the early, say, you can see the date on the screen, 750 CE. Vikings began to organize these Norsemen. And they began to raid border towns. They didn't want to go deep in the interior. They began to raid border towns. And they would raid places like England, France, Russia, even Italy and the Byzantine Empire. And what they would do is they would come in, they would raid the town through brute strength. They would pillage and plunder, and then they would leave and trade the goods on their peripheries. What they found over time, however, was that due to the reputation as being brutes and violent, people began just basically paying tribute. People would basically pay to not get, killed or pillaged or plundered. And so they found that was much more effective, and they began to organize. And over time, it became more of a trade network akin to the Indian Ocean trade and the Mediterranean Sea trade than it was the stereotypical of raid, plunder, and pillage like was so popular in movies. Now, if you were in class right now, I would actually play a video for you from Crash Course. This Crash Course has a great Viking video. And so I'm going to change my slide. I highly suggest that you go and check out the Crash Course video. It's a Crash Course World History, just simply titled Crash Course World History Vikings. Again, it's only about 12 minutes long, as most Crash Course videos are, but it's well worth watching to understand just how this whole process played out. But what we do know is that the Vikings are going to not just stay in Europe, they're the ones that are first going to create colonies in Iceland and Greenland. And while we're not fully sure about where, we also fully believe that people like Leif Erikson are going to make it all the way into modern-day Canada as they begin to look for new areas to make settlements and stay away from mainland Europe, who at times wanted to kill them. Now, these networks would kind of die off until after about 1100 CE. Now, to replace that, we have a new trade group that would develop. This is called the Hanseatic League. This is a group of German traders and various German clans. Remember, Germany itself was not unified until the 1800s. And so what we called Germany, or the Germanic tribes, was just a bunch of loose affiliated kingdoms. Well, a group of these trading guilds began to unify and form what was called the Hanseatic League. And you see the dates on the screen. They will form about around 1200 CE and will continue up until the Age of Exploration around 1500 CE. And this group would basically replace the Vikings as the major trading group in the north part of Europe. And they become these major trading hubs on what is now the north part of, northern edges of Germany, and they will trade with Scandinavian countries, Russia, and England. And they will then connect this trade into places like Venice and into the Mediterranean Sea trade, and then also can pass it off to places that would connect to the Silk Road trade. I have a short little video for this to kind of explain the Hanseatic League. I think it's a topic I'll bring up again later on as well, because this does, again, bridge into the next era of world history.
Throughout medieval European history, one of the most interesting institutions was the Hanseatic League, a group of merchant towns who essentially monopolised trade over the Baltic Sea as well as dominating trade in the North Sea too. Despite how strange this arrangement of states and traders was, it isn't very well understood. So what exactly was the Hanseatic League and what happened to it? So as of the 13th century, sea trade across the North and Baltic seas had existed for many centuries, but such trade was fraught with risks, notably from
And
pirates and
Vikings.
rough weather. As such, to minimise those risks, some trading towns along the southern Baltic shore formed a trading union. This allowed them to collectively bargain for lower tariffs, to travel in larger groups to ward off pirates, to monopolise trade in certain goods, and deter any armies from conquering them. To join this union, a town had to meet two criteria. It had to be self-governing, although they could still swear fealty to a lord, the king, or the Holy Roman Emperor, and it had to be a port town connected to the North or Baltic seas. And together they would send representatives to a Grand Council. Here they would discuss trade policies, such as who to embargo and who to demand more concessions from. They would choose new members to admit or vote on who to kick out, but outside of this there was very little in the way of any centralised governance. Another thing to note is that the Hanseatic League didn't look like this. The states to which the cities owed fealty didn't have the same rights as the cities themselves, and in fact many noble rulers weren't keen on the League, since it made independently wealthy men who were loyal to profit and not them. Over the following centuries, the Hanseatic League grew in membership and won very important concessions. The most notable of these were in Novgorod, London, Bergen and Bruges, later Antwerp. Here they were able to avoid most tariffs and, to use a technical term, make fat steps. This worked for the rulers of these places like King Henry III of England, because it meant that his people could acquire luxury goods but not take the risks that came with ocean-bound trade. As you'll guess though, this state of affairs didn't last, and in the 15th century the League began to decline. So why? Well, the first reason was that other states started to build up their own navies, which the League struggled to compete with. Denmark, Norway and Sweden united briefly and soon reneged on their deals with the League. Poland and Lithuania united and was able to price some of the towns out of the League as well. And Novgorod wanted its own slice of Baltic trade, whereas in the North Sea, England needed fleets if it was ever going to conquer France, which meant that it could protect and support its own merchants. And these things combined at the same time saw the merchants of the League lose a lot of money. Also, the collective benefits of no tariffs soon became the collective responsibility of fighting wars. And the last issue was that the nature of trade changed, because regional trade soon lost out to global trade. And with that, the source of both changed, and much like their Italian equivalents to the south, they lost their position. Which is why, in the early 17th century, the League was dissolved. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patron.
Yes. And that last thing he said there is very important. One of the reasons this Hanseatic League, along with the Indian Ocean trade, the Mediterranean Sea trade, the Trans-Saharan trade, the Silk Road trade, the Indian Ocean trade, but the reason all these trade networks worked, number one, was they were independent people that allowed nations and governments to get luxury goods without the risk. And these are private venture groups, essentially. But one of the reasons these things work so well is that there was a relative peace in the kind of Afro-Eurasian world during this period. This worked because of Pax Mongolica. Pax Mongolica. There was the Mongol peace. And post-1200, when we see, the Hanseatic League rising, they're able to take advantage of this relative peace that the Mongol Empire created. Likewise, throughout the Muslim world, including Trans-Saharan trade into the western half of the Silk Road trade, Dar al-Islam, or House of Islam, is going to make trade far more appealing. That these terms, these ideas that there was relative peace in these regions, either from the Mongol rule or the Islamic ideas of that supported trade networks and trading itself, and merchants and traders, it's going to allow these networks to flourish and to expand. And it's not until we get to the 1500s when we start going to more global trade, but also nations competing for imperialism, that we see these trade networks begin to decline. But during this era, whether it's starting in about 600 CE all the way up into about 1500, these trade networks are going to flourish and overlap and continue to grow and expand because, these major, huge empires and ideas, including Islamic religion, is going to create relative peace. And in the end, what you see is travelers begin to travel across the entirety including people like Marco Polo or Ivan Batutu, which, by the way, most likely all of you are going to see in a writing assignment pretty soon. And of course, the very famous story of Mansa Musa, who's going to essentially hand out so much gold along his journey of this trade network route as he travels to Mecca. He's going to crash the economy in Cairo because he hands out so many goods trying to display his wealth as an African king. So, what do we make of all this? Well, as you can see, it was during this period while the empires themselves seem to be in somewhat decline from the classical era, the trade networks, and as we're going to also mention, religion is going to become a unifying force. Trade and religion, let me say it again, trade and religion will become unifying forces that will still connect over entire continents and regions, including over the Afro-Eurasian megacontinent. But likewise, there are also simultaneous trade networks in the Americas. Now, they don't get as much press, as much coverage in textbooks, and we don't know quite as much about it as there are fewer written records regarding it. And to be clear, it was a smaller scale compared to its Afro-Eurasian counterparts. But that's also in part because there were fewer people. There were approximately 100 to 200 million people on Earth at the time, and only about somewhere around 15 to 20% of them lived in what is now the Americas, North and South. And also, in what is now the Americas, there were far fewer pack animals, or large domesticated animals, beasts of burden. Whereas you have camels that facilitate the Indian Ocean trade, and you have horses in Europe and in Southwest Asia, and eventually into China. In the Americas, there were no large domesticated animals other than the llama and alpaca in South America. And while these were domesticated, they didn't travel north because they couldn't really get through the Isthmus of Panama that connects Central America to South America. The narrow jungle there and the Isthmus of Panama makes travel north to south very difficult. In addition, because of the lack of pack animals, the wheel was not developed in the Americas because there was no need for it, unlike in Europe and Afro-Eurasia, because, well, they had horses and camels and cattle and oxen to pull large carts and wheeled carts. But despite all this, we know that trade networks existed. Most were north-south. We believe they were mostly relay-style networks, as in village to village, and then village to village, so village A to village B to village C to village D to village E, and so forth. That's how it transported. And we know that because we found pottery from the Inca in central Mexico. We found pottery from central Mexico in what is now the United States. We know that it transmitted ideas of how to grow corn and tobacco. We know that manufactured goods like turquoise and gold and pottery and jade will travel up and down through Mexico to South America. We have found, if you go to my map here, a major network here is Cahokia in modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. We've found fish bones from Florida in Missouri. We've also found these same fish bones and trade goods from Florida to Cahokia, Missouri to Montana. So we know these trade networks existed. There's a major trade network out in the U.S. Southwest from Chaco Canyon that became this major trade network that extended both north and south from what is modern-day New Mexico and Colorado down into Mexico, but also out to California. It's also what we believe, again, we don't have definitive proof, but we believe the knowledge of growing maize or corn spread originally from Mesoamerica, modern-day kind of central or South Mexico, Central America, to the United States. And Native Americans in what is now the United States would take that knowledge and begin to plant corn. We also know that the most trade took place between the Maya and Teotihuacan, and then between the Moche civilization down in modern-day Peru. All this to say, during this period as the calendar changes from BCE to CE, toward the end of the classical age, or classical empire period. What we see is while these empires come and go, the trade networks grow, they intensify, they evolve, and they create a more interconnected world than even previously thought. And this before the age of exploration beginning in the 1450s. And so these trade networks can be viewed as an almost empire in and of themselves, as we see them facilitate the transmission of ideas and people and manufactured goods and religion and, of course, disease. All right, guys. Until next time, take care and bye-bye.